Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. Many of you may know that my wife experienced something of a health crisis last week, and so I spent most of last week in the hospital and had little time to think of or prepare something fresh and new for these morning moments. So I thought about how last week I was sharing some articles I had written for Redeemer's monthly newsletter about why we do what we do and explaining the background and meaning of some of the things we do in worship. And I decided that since my time was so occupied, you would be understanding of me rehashing something like that again in this particular situation. You see, each month I also write a pastoral article for the newsletter, and I call it Sightings, because most months I try to describe some way God has shown up unexpectedly. I hope that as I share how I was surprised by God, that my readers will find God showing up in their lives too, and will be intentional about watching for God. I arrived to begin serving Redeemer in August of 2001, and so the idea I had was to go back to the beginning, to my first Easter here at Redeemer, and take a look at what I wrote for the newsletter then. That first year I was here, the newsletter was done differently, so I don't really have copies of what I did I can replicate, but I do starting with 2003. So this week I plan to share the newsletter articles I wrote for Easter in 2003 through 2007. Thank you for understanding that with what has been going on in my life, I needed to do something old instead of something new. Here's what I wrote in 2003, and you need to know that at the time, Redeemer was communing people in the traditional way of giving a wafer and then a small cup of wine. Except for, well, here's what I wrote. It happens just about every week. I watch for it because at one service or the other, somebody's going to make this mistake. They're going to eat the bread at communion. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a mistake. That's what you're supposed to do. Well, it is if you're sitting in the congregation. But Redeemer has this odd little variance to that if you are an acolyte or a crucifer or a worship assistant. If you are one of those people for that service, you go behind the altar for communion, and when I give you the bread, you are supposed to hold on to it and then dip it in the chalice. It's a process we call intinction. That way we preserve the idea for the whole congregation that we share one cup in Christ. At least that's what's supposed to happen. But pretty much every week, someone up there forgets. Oh, I understand it all right. These folks aren't up there week after week like I am, and it's only natural to receive the wafer and put it in your mouth like you normally do. So I watch for it, and when it happens, I hand the person another wafer and say, "You'll probably need this in a minute." Typically, they stare at me with a confused look until they realize what they did. And then I tell them, it's okay. It happens every week. And it does, sometimes more than once. Now, I'm telling you all that because of what happened just a couple of weeks ago. The worship assistant who sits on my side of the sanctuary had forgotten to hold his wafer to dip it in the wine, and I had given him another one. And then, when everything was concluded, and I returned to my seat for the final hymn, he leaned over to me with a smile and said by way of explanation, "I was hungry, I guess." Have you ever had the experience where you say something and you are surprised to hear what you say? Well, that's what happened then. God gave me some words that just popped out before I could think. I nodded to the altar and said, "I think it's a good thing to be hungry for God's grace." He smiled back and we started singing the hymn. That is what draws us here, you know. We hunger for God's grace in our lives. We need to draw near to God. We need to know God's love. We need to share our lives with God's family. And as we gather around God's altar here, those are the very gifts we receive. It's what Easter is all about. We hunger for God's grace. On Easter, God fills us with it. God fills us with his love. God gives us the meal of salvation. It happens here every week. I'm glad it does. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.